The book of Genesis, consisting of 50 chapters, is the first book in the Holy Bible and a foundational text for the Christian faith as well as Judaism, and has significant influence on Islamic tradition as well. Let's dive into a summary of all 50 chapters. Genesis chapter 1 recounts God's creation of the universe in 7 days. On the first day, God commanded light to exist, creating day and night. On the second day, He created the sky by separating the waters above from the waters below. On the third day, God gathered the waters to reveal dry land and brought forth vegetation on the earth. On the fourth day, He created the sun, moon, and stars to separate day from night and mark the passage of time. On the fifth day, God filled the waters with living creatures and the sky with birds. On the sixth day, He created land animals and mankind in His own image, granting humans dominion over all living things. After completing His creation, God saw that it was very good. In Genesis chapter 2, God forms man from the dust and breathes life into him, placing him in the Garden of Eden. God creates woman from man's rib as his companion, establishing marriage and unity between them. They live in paradise, naked and unashamed, until they eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge of good and evil. In Genesis chapter 3, the serpent deceives Eve, leading her and Adam to eat from the forbidden tree of knowledge of good and evil, resulting in their expulsion from Eden. God pronounces curses on the serpent, the woman, and the man, but also provides hope through the promise of a future Savior. Adam and Eve leave the garden to cultivate the land, and they begin to experience the consequences of their disobedience. By Genesis chapter 4, Adam and Eve have 2 grown sons, Cain and Abel. Cain kills his brother Abel out of jealousy, and God punishes him by making him a wanderer on the earth. Cain's descendants are listed, including his son, Enoch, who walks with God, and Lamech, who boasts of his violence. Genesis chapter 5 takes us through the genealogy from Adam to Noah, spanning 10 generations and highlighting the ages of each patriarch at the birth of their firstborn sons. This genealogy emphasizes the longevity of these early figures and serves as a bridge to the narrative of Noah and the flood. In Genesis chapter 6, wickedness spreads throughout the earth, prompting God to decide to destroy humanity with a flood. Noah, a righteous man, is instructed to build an ark to save himself, his family, and a pair of every type of animal. In Genesis chapter 7, Noah and his family enter the ark along with the animals, and the floodwaters begin. The rain falls for 40 days and nights, and the waters continue to rise for 150 days. Eventually, the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and as the waters recede, the ark settles on dry land. In Genesis chapter 8, the floodwaters begin to recede, and Noah sends out a raven and a dove to find dry land. When the dove returns with an olive leaf, Noah knows that the waters have receded enough for the earth to be inhabited again. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices to God, who promises never again to curse the ground because of humanity's sinfulness. Noah's descendants spread out across the planet. Genesis chapter 9 recounts God's covenant with Noah and his descendants following the flood, blessing them to be fruitful and granting them dominion over animals, alongside permission to eat meat while forbidding the consumption of blood. It mentions Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and how Noah, after becoming drunk and uncovered in his tent, curses Ham's son Canaan, while blessing Shem and Japheth for their respectful response. In Genesis chapter 10, the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, are listed, detailing the nations that descended from them. These nations spread out over the earth after the flood, each with its own language and territory. The chapter highlights the genealogy of various peoples, including the Canaanites, from whom the Israelites would later descend. In Genesis chapter 11, humanity unites in rebellion against God by building the Tower of Babel, prompting God to confuse their languages and scatter them across the earth so that they are unable to complete their project. This event leads to the origin of different languages and the dispersion of humanity into many separate nations and cultures. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls Abram to leave his country and promises to bless him, make him a great nation, and bless all the families of the earth through him. Abram obeys and travels to Canaan with his wife Sarai and nephew Lot. In Canaan, God appears to Abram and promises to give the land to his descendants. Abram builds altars to worship God and continues on his journey. In Genesis chapter 13, Abram and his nephew Lot separate due to conflict between their herdsmen. Abram settles in Canaan, and God reaffirms his promise to give the land to Abram's descendants. Lot chooses to dwell in the fertile plain of the Jordan and eventually settles near Sodom. In Genesis chapter 14, Abram's nephew Lot has been captured by a coalition of 4 eastern kings. Abram bravely assembles a force of armed men from his household and comes to Lot's rescue. Abram then refuses to take any spoils from the king of Sodom, acknowledging that his power and wealth come from God alone. Genesis chapter 15 recounts a pivotal moment in the relationship between God and Abram. As the sun sets, Abram falls into a deep sleep, and God appears to him in a dream. During this dream, God reveals that Abram will have a son, and that his descendants will be strangers in a land not their own, where they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. However, God assures Abram that he will punish that nation, and that Abram's descendants will leave that land with great possessions. Genesis chapter 16 recounts how Abram's barren wife, Sarai, urges him to conceive a child with her Egyptian maidservant, Hagar, to fulfill God's promise of descendants. Abram agrees, but the women grow to despise each other after Hagar becomes pregnant, leading Hagar to flee into the wilderness. There, an angel of the Lord appears and tells Hagar that her son will father a multitude of descendants. Hagar believes and returns, giving birth to Ishmael. In Genesis chapter 17, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and his wife Sarai's name to Sarah. He renews his covenant with Abraham, commanding that Abraham and the males in his household be circumcised. Abraham obeys. Genesis chapter 18 begins with messengers from the Lord telling Abraham and Sarah that elderly Sarah will bear a son within a year. Sarah laughs in disbelief. The chapter then shifts to a more somber tone as the messengers set out toward Sodom, revealing to Abraham that God plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah due to their great sin. Abraham intercedes for the cities, and the Lord agrees that for the sake of even just 10 righteous people there, he would not destroy the cities. In Genesis chapter 19, Abraham's nephew Lot protects God's messengers from an aggressive mob in Sodom. The angels warn Lot to flee with his family, as God plans to destroy the city for its wickedness. They escape the destruction, but Lot's wife looks back and turns into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters hide in a cave, where the daughters, believing they are the last humans, get Lot drunk to conceive children by him. In Genesis chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah travel to Gerar, where Abraham, fearing for his life due to Sarah's beauty, tells the locals she is his sister. King Abimelech takes Sarah into his household, but when God warns him in a dream about the truth, Abimelech confronts Abraham, who admits his deception. In Genesis chapter 21, Abraham's wife Sarah gives birth to Isaac, fulfilling God's promise, and they circumcise the child. Sarah then demands that her handmaiden Hagar and Hagar's young son, Ishmael, be sent away. They go into the desert where God provides for them. In Genesis chapter 22, God tests Abraham's faith by commanding him to sacrifice his beloved son, Isaac. Abraham obeys, building an altar and preparing to sacrifice Isaac, but at the last moment, God intervenes and provides a ram for the offering instead. Abraham's immense faith is thus proven. In Genesis chapter 23, Abraham's beloved wife Sarah dies at the age of 127. Abraham mourns for her and negotiates with the Hittites to purchase the cave of Machpelah and the surrounding fields as a burial site. This transaction marks the first piece of the promised land that Abraham legally owns. Genesis chapter 24 recounts Abraham's servant's mission to find a wife for Isaac. He travels to his master's homeland to seek a bride from among his relatives. Guided by a divine sign, the servant recognizes Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, as the chosen one. Both Rebekah and her family consent to the arrangement, leading to her marriage with Isaac. Genesis chapter 25 begins with Abraham's marriage to Keturah, with whom he has 6 sons. Abraham eventually dies at the age of 175 and is buried in the cave of Machpelah next to his Sarah. The chapter then shifts focus to Isaac and Rebekah and their twin sons. Esau, the elder, is described as a skillful hunter, while Jacob is more domestic. Genesis chapter 26 narrates Isaac's struggles and travels during a famine. God instructs him to move to Gerar, where Isaac deceives the Philistines by claiming his wife Rebekah is his sister, echoing Abraham's similar deception. King Abimelech discovers the truth but protects them. Isaac prospers, causing envy among the Philistines, who stop up his wells. The chapter ends with Esau's marriages to Hittite women, causing grief to his parents. In Genesis chapter 27, Isaac, who has grown old and blind, asks his son Esau to prepare a meal so that he may bless him. However, Rebekah devises a deception. She instructs Jacob to disguise himself as Esau and receive the blessing instead. The ruse succeeds, and Esau becomes so furious that he vows to kill Jacob. Fearing for Jacob's safety, Rebekah sends him away. In Genesis chapter 28, Jacob embarks on a journey to the land of his mother's people to find a wife. During his travels, he experiences a divine dream where he sees a sacred ladder extending to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. In this vision, God assures Jacob of blessings for him and his descendants. Upon awakening, Jacob makes a solemn vow, promising to offer a tenth of his possessions as a tithe to God if he protects and guides him on his journey. In Genesis 29, Jacob arrives in Paddan Aram and immediately falls in love with Rachel upon meeting her. He agrees to work for her father Laban for 7 years in exchange for Rachel's hand in marriage. However, Laban deceives him by substituting Leah, Rachel's older sister, on the wedding night. Jacob confronts Laban, and an agreement is made, allowing him to marry Rachel as well. The chapter concludes with Leah bearing 4 sons for Jacob, while Rachel remains childless. Genesis chapter 30 delves into the intense family drama between Jacob's wives. Rachel, unable to bear children, offers her maid Bilhah to Jacob, resulting in the birth of Dan and Naphtali. In response, Leah gives her maid Zilpah to Jacob, leading to the birth of Gad and Asher. Leah herself bears 2 more sons and a daughter. Eventually, God blesses Rachel, and she gives birth to Joseph, ending her barrenness and bringing her great joy. In Genesis chapter 31, Jacob secretly flees Laban's household with his family and possessions, while Rachel steals her father's household gods. When Laban discovers their departure, he pursues and confronts them, leading to a tense exchange where Jacob defends his actions. Eventually, they reconcile and set up a stone pillar as a sign of their mutual agreement and respect. Genesis chapter 32 narrates Jacob's anxious preparations for reuniting with his estranged brother Esau. Despite encountering angels of God, Jacob is filled with fear and sends messengers ahead with gifts to appease Esau. The night before the meeting, Jacob wrestles with a mysterious divine being until dawn. Despite being injured, Jacob persists and is blessed with the name Israel, symbolizing his struggle with God. Genesis chapter 33 recounts the emotional reunion between Jacob and Esau. As Jacob approaches Esau, fearing hostility, he is surprised when Esau runs to embrace him. Jacob introduces his family and insists on giving Esau gifts. Later on, Jacob settles his family in Shechem, purchasing land and erecting an altar to honor God for the successful reunion with his brother. Genesis 34 recounts the tragic story of Jacob's daughter Dinah, who is violated by Shechem, the son of the local prince Hamor. Shechem desires to marry Dinah, and his father proposes the union to Jacob. Outraged, Dinah's brothers deceitfully agree to the marriage on the condition that all the men of Shechem city be circumcised. They agree, and while the men are in pain and recovering, Dinah's brothers attack the city, killing all the males including Hamor and Shechem, and rescue their sister. Jacob reprimands his sons, fearing retaliation, but they defend their actions. In Genesis chapter 35, God instructs Jacob to go to Bethel to build an altar, leading Jacob to have his household discard their foreign gods. They journey to Bethel, where God reaffirms Jacob's new name, Israel, and promises that nations and kings will come from him. Tragedy strikes when Rachel dies, giving birth to Benjamin, and is buried near Bethlehem. Finally, Jacob returns to his father Isaac in Mamre, where Isaac dies at 180 years old and is buried by his sons. Genesis chapter 36 details the genealogy and descendants of Esau, beginning with his wives and children. The chapter also lists the chiefs of the Edomites who ruled before any king reigned over the Israelites. This genealogical record underscores the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. In Genesis chapter 37, Joseph, favored by his father Jacob, is given a special coat of many colors. He further incites jealousy among his brothers by sharing dreams that suggest his future dominance over them. When the brothers are out tending flocks, they plot to kill Joseph, but at Reuben's urging, throw him into a cistern instead. Later, they sell Joseph to Ishmaelite traders heading to Egypt. They deceive their father into believing Joseph was killed by a wild animal by showing him the bloodied coat, leaving Jacob devastated. Meanwhile, Joseph is sold in Egypt to Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, setting the stage for his future triumphs in Egypt. Genesis chapter 38 tells the story of Jacob's son Judah and his interactions with his daughter-in-law Tamar. Judah arranges a marriage between his firstborn, and Tamar. However, Is wicked and is put to death by the Lord. Judah then instructs his second son, Onan, to marry Tamar and produce offspring for his deceased brother, but Onan refuses to impregnate her and spills his seed on the ground instead. God is displeased and puts Onan to death as well. Fearing for the life of his last living son, Judah tells Tamar to live as a widow until the boy grows up. However, Judah has no intention of honoring his word, so Tamar takes matters into her own hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute and sleeps with Judah, conceiving twins. When Judah discovers she is pregnant, he orders her to be burned, but she reveals that he is the father. Judah acknowledges his wrongdoing, and Tamar's lineage ultimately leads to King David and even Jesus Christ. Genesis chapter 39 focuses on Joseph's life in Egypt after being sold by his brothers to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. Potiphar notices Joseph's success and entrusts him with the management of his household. However, Potiphar's wife attempts to seduce Joseph, who resists her advances. Enraged by his rejection, she falsely accuses Joseph of assault, leading to his imprisonment. Even in prison, the Lord remains with Joseph, granting him favor with the prison warden, who puts Joseph in charge of all the prisoners. Genesis chapter 40 recounts Joseph interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and baker while they are imprisoned with him. With God's guidance, Joseph tells the cupbearer that in 3 days he will be restored to his position and asks to be mentioned to Pharaoh. For the baker, Joseph predicts that in 3 days he will be hanged. As Joseph foretold, the cupbearer is reinstated and the baker is executed. However, the cupbearer forgets to mention Joseph to Pharaoh, leaving him in prison. In Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh has 2 troubling dreams that none of his advisors can interpret. The chief cupbearer remembers Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, so Joseph is summoned from prison. He explains that the dreams predict 7 years of abundance in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. Impressed by Joseph's wisdom, Pharaoh appoints him as second in command over Egypt to oversee the collection of surplus grain during the plentiful years. Joseph successfully implements this plan. In Genesis chapter 42, the famine reaches Canaan, prompting Jacob to send all his sons except Benjamin to Egypt for grain. They unknowingly meet Joseph, who recognizes them but conceals his identity. To test them, Joseph accuses them of being spies and imprisons them for 3 days, then releases them but demands they return with their youngest brother Benjamin to prove their honesty, keeping Simeon as a hostage. In Genesis chapter 43, the severe famine in Canaan compels Jacob to send his sons, including Benjamin, back to Egypt to buy more grain. Joseph orders a feast to be prepared for them, and during the meal astonishes his brothers by seating them in birth order and serving Benjamin 5 times more food than the others. This is part of Joseph's plan to test the character of his brothers. The chapter concludes with the brothers preparing to return to Canaan, unaware of the final test Joseph has in store for them. In Genesis chapter 44, Joseph secretly places his silver cup in Benjamin's sack before his brothers depart for Canaan. After they leave, Joseph instructs his steward to pursue and accuse them of theft. When the cup is found, the brothers return to Joseph's house and plead for mercy. Judah steps forward, offering to take Benjamin's place as a slave to spare their father further grief. This act of self-sacrifice and solidarity pleases Joseph, as it reveals the brothers' changed hearts. In Genesis chapter 45, Joseph finally reveals his true identity to his brothers, explaining that even though they sold him into slavery, it was all part of God's plan. He instructs his brothers to retrieve their father from Canaan and bring their families to Egypt to settle in the land of Goshen. Pharaoh hears of Joseph's reunion with his brothers and offers them the best of the land. The chapter concludes with the brothers returning home to share the news with Jacob, who is overjoyed to learn that Joseph is alive. In Genesis chapter 46, Jacob sets out for Egypt with his entire family, totaling 70 persons. Upon arriving, he has an emotional reunion with his son Joseph. Joseph then instructs his family on how to present themselves to Pharaoh, emphasizing their occupation as shepherds so they can settle in the land of Goshen, which is suited for their livestock. In Genesis chapter 47, Jacob and his family settle in Egypt. As the famine persists, the Egyptians begin to sell their livestock, land, and ultimately themselves to Pharaoh in exchange for food, resulting in Pharaoh owning nearly all property in Egypt. Joseph implements a system where the people give 1/5 of their produce to Pharaoh as a form of tax. Jacob lives in Egypt for 17 years, and before his death, he makes Joseph swear to bury him in his ancestral land. In Genesis chapter 48, as elderly Jacob's health declines, Joseph visits him with his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Jacob adopts Joseph's sons as his own, granting them equal status with his other sons regarding inheritance, and prophesies that the younger son Ephraim will become greater than Manasseh. He continues by blessing Joseph and giving him a portion of land to indicate Joseph's special status among his brothers. In Genesis chapter 49, Jacob gathers his 12 sons to deliver his final blessings and prophecies concerning their futures. Reuben is chastised and loses his birthright, while Simeon and Levi are reprimanded for their violence. Judah is praised and promised a royal lineage. Joseph receives a favorable prophecy, highlighting his triumphs, and Benjamin is described as a ravenous wolf, symbolizing future warriors. The other sons receive blessings related to prosperity and independence, collectively setting the stage for the 12 tribes of Israel. In Genesis chapter 50, Joseph mourns the death of his father Jacob, who passes away at the age of 147. After Jacob's burial, Joseph's brothers fear retribution for their past betrayal and seek his forgiveness. Joseph reassures them, affirming that God intended his position in Egypt to save many lives. Joseph lives to see his son's prosperity in Egypt. Before his death at the age of 110, Joseph instructs the Israelites to carry his bones with them when they eventually depart Egypt for the land promised to their ancestors by God. So ends the book of Genesis.